The security checkpoint buzzed with controlled tension until Captain Morrison's suspicion reached its breaking point. "Check her credentials again, Sergeant Blake," he commanded, doubt clear in his voice. The unassuming woman in civilian clothes stood quietly at the entry gate, while an old German shepherd wandered past the security detail and performed one action that changed everything. The effect was immediate. The duty guard's clipboard slipped from his hands, hitting the concrete floor. Senior personnel froze at their security stations, and faces drained of color throughout the facility. No one had expected a retired military working dog to recognize her. No one had expected the quiet woman with questionable documentation to be connected to a classified mission spanning decades. No one had expected the truth. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story captivated you, please consider subscribing. We share powerful stories of unsung heroes every week. The main security gate hummed with the constant buzz of electronic scanners and muted conversations. Banks of monitors cast blue light across vigilant faces, illuminating access logs dotted with red security alerts and green authorized entries. The air carried the scent of strong coffee and electronic equipment, mixed with the tension that came with monitoring base entry protocols. It was 0800 hours on what had begun as a routine morning shift at Joint Base Harmony, nestled in the Virginia countryside. Specialist third-class Maria Santos stood at the civilian processing station, deliberately unremarkable in her plain business attire and simple shoulder bag. Her auburn hair fell loosely around her shoulders. No visible identification except for a temporary visitor badge. Early 30s, with a composed face that spoke of intelligence rather than anxiety. Her green eyes moved constantly between security personnel and monitoring screens, while her presence demanded nothing from the scrutiny around her. To a casual observer, she might have been any contractor, a recent hire from civilian sector perhaps, or another face in the endless stream of base visitors. She occasionally adjusted her temporary documentation, her movements calm and deliberate. Unlike the guards and senior NCOs who filled the security checkpoint with their rank insignia and combat patches, she wore no visible markers of military training or security clearance. Just a civilian, it seemed, with questionable credentials and a request for base access. The security review underway involved a routine contractor verification for Maria Santos, seeking entry for what appeared to be routine administrative meetings. The process had proceeded through standard phases: initial document review, background check initiation, and now secondary verification due to discrepancies in her identification records. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran security specialist with something to prove, coordinated the verification process with practiced efficiency, moving between workstations and checking status displays throughout the security floor. Ms. Santos had submitted documentation that raised several red flags, Rodriguez explained to the watch commander, his voice carrying across the checkpoint bay. Her decision to arrive without proper pre-authorization created complications for standard entry procedures. Captain Morrison sat rigid at the security console, his face a careful mask. A decorated military police officer with 18 years of service, he looked somehow troubled in his dress uniform, as if the weight of the security decision had physically aged him in recent hours. Maria watched it all, her expression revealing nothing. Only the occasional glance toward the K-9 kennels visible through the checkpoint windows suggested any emotional response to the ongoing process. When the watch commander called for a documentation update, heads turned in mild surprise as Maria raised her hands slightly from her position at the processing station. Ms. Santos has been providing additional verification materials, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced. She may have supporting documentation for her access request. She moved to the central verification area with a deliberate precision that seemed at odds with her civilian status. Something about her bearing, spine straight, steps measured, chin level, caught the attention of a graying colonel seated near the main display. He frowned slightly, studying her with newfound interest. Captain Morrison, sharp-eyed and methodical, watched her with narrowed attention as she prepared her additional documentation. The captain was known for his no-nonsense approach to base security and access protocols. Today, he wore his authority like a burden, his dress uniform crisp despite the early hour. "Please state your purpose for base access," instructed Captain Morrison. "Maria Santos, administrative contractor," she replied. Her voice was soft but clear, her civilian-bearing professional. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez began his questioning, and Maria's responses were factual and precise, but delivered in such a measured, quiet tone that Captain Morrison soon grew visibly skeptical. Several times, the security recorder had to ask her to repeat her statements. Miss Santos, Captain Morrison finally interrupted. The entire security team needs to hear your credentials clearly. Please speak up. Yes, Captain, Maria responded, barely raising her volume. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued. Miss Santos, can you explain the nature of your administrative work requiring base access? I've been contracted to review personnel records and cross-reference administrative files with current operational requirements, she replied, her voice still frustratingly soft. I've been assigned to analyze several discrepancies in personnel management systems that require on-site verification. And what were your findings during previous reviews? I determined that the personnel systems contain significant inconsistencies that aren't reflected in current administrative assessments. I also noted substantial variations in service records that indicate potential security concerns. Did you document these observations? Yes, I logged all discrepancies and attempted verification through available personnel databases. Was this analysis reviewed by administration? It was not forwarded beyond my immediate contractor supervisor. The security officer, Major Patricia Voss, approached for additional questioning with a skeptical demeanor. Tall and imposing with steel-gray hair that lent her an air of authority, she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to challenging questionable credentials. Miss Santos, what specific administrative training qualifies you to analyze military personnel records? I completed standard personnel management certification during my civilian training program. And what level of clearance? Her tone suggested the answer would confirm Santos's limitations. I maintain appropriate clearance levels for administrative contractor work, Maria responded evenly. Major Voss smiled thinly. Miss Santos, how could you possibly understand the complexities of military personnel systems and security protocols when you've been working as a contractor for only 10 months? Something flickered across Captain Morrison's face. A brief shadow of recognition quickly suppressed. He studied Maria more intently now. Objection to characterization, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called out. Ms. Santos's credentials should be evaluated on merit. Sustained, Captain Morrison replied, his eyes never leaving Maria. Major Voss adjusted her approach. Let me rephrase. What specific military experience do you have with personnel management in operational environments? Maria paused before answering, her eyes briefly meeting those of the graying colonel near the main display. My background includes some practical application of personnel administration, she said carefully. Could you be more specific? That information involves previous contracts that may not be relevant to current access requirements. Major Voss looked to the commanding officer. Captain, if the contractor lacks relevant military experience with personnel systems, her access request should be considered accordingly. I'll allow the line of questioning, Captain Morrison ruled. Ms. Santos, please provide more detail about your relevant experience. Maria's expression remained neutral. My previous administrative experience involves classified contractor programs. How convenient, Major Voss remarked dryly. So we're expected to grant base access based on your personnel analysis without knowing your actual qualifications to make such assessments? I'm reporting on discrepancies I identified using established administrative protocols. As the questioning continued, Maria responded with increasingly precise details about personnel management techniques, security clearance procedures, and administrative protocols that made several security officers at the checkpoint exchange glances. She referenced specific personnel systems, administrative configurations, and security measures that seemed beyond the knowledge base of a standard civilian contractor. When shown a personnel roster from the base, her eyes lingered on it a moment longer than necessary, her composure wavering almost imperceptibly before returning to professional detachment. Do you recognize these personnel records, Ms. Santos? Major Voss asked. Yes, they represent the administrative files I've been contracted to review and verify. And your analysis of these records proved to be, what exactly? The discrepancies you identified in personnel management. How does that affect current security protocols? Maria's voice remained steady. The administrative inconsistencies I identified indicate personnel records that aren't reflected in current security assessments. My recommendation for enhanced verification procedures was documented in my contractor reports. At the security checkpoint, the older colonel with gray hair and multiple service ribbons watched Maria with growing intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration as if trying to place a half-remembered face from personnel files. The morning hours passed as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez returned for follow-up questions, asking Maria about specific access requirements for the current review. Can you explain the standard protocols for a personnel verification project of this nature? Rodriguez asked. The administrative team would have established primary and secondary access permissions with base security, she explained, her voice still frustratingly soft. Standard protocol requires verified identification and clearance confirmation at predetermined security levels. And if those credentials were insufficient or questionable, the backup verification would proceed using alternative authentication methods after primary credentials were assessed, utilizing specialized clearance protocols on confirmed security systems. She explained with a level of technical precision that raised eyebrows among the security staff present. Captain Morrison leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. Miss Santos, I've asked you repeatedly to speak up. This security checkpoint cannot properly evaluate credentials, it cannot hear clearly. I apologize, Captain, Maria replied, her volume barely increasing. The older colonel at the security checkpoint now sat forward at his workstation, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. Recognition seemed to be dawning slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to alarm. Major Voss seized on the captain's frustration. Perhaps Ms. Santos's reluctance to speak clearly reflects her limited confidence in her own credentials. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood immediately. Ma'am, that's inappropriate speculation. Noted, Staff Sergeant, Captain Morrison replied sharply. Major Voss, confine your remarks to relevant questions for the contractor. Major Voss nodded in acknowledgement. Ms. Santos, in your assessment as an administrative contractor, was there anything about the personnel analysis you conducted that would indicate modified security requirements? Maria looked directly at the main security display for the first time. The personnel assessment suggested administrative modifications beyond current security estimates. That wasn't my question. Based on what you analyzed, should security procedures have been modified? Based on the administrative discrepancies I identified, yes. But my assessment was not included in security planning. Major Voss's expression hardened. Are you suggesting that administrative information was deliberately ignored by security staff? I'm stating that the personnel analysis I provided differed significantly from the security assessment that was distributed to base personnel. The security checkpoint stirred with murmurs. Captain Morrison tapped his pen once against his desk, restoring order. Miss Santos, Captain Morrison said, his voice tight with growing impatience. You'll need to explain that assertion clearly and audibly for the security staff. What specifically was different about your analysis? Maria paused, her eyes scanning the security checkpoint briefly before returning to the captain. When she spoke, her voice remained soft, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear. My personnel analysis indicated that the administrative records included classified service histories using documentation normally reserved for special operations personnel. That information was not included in the security briefing provided to base staff. Captain Morrison's head snapped up, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time. The graying colonel's expression darkened as he studied Maria with new intensity. Miss Santos, Captain Morrison said firmly, frustration evident in his tone. This is the final time I will ask you to speak louder. The entire security staff must be able to hear credential reports accurately. Maria looked directly at Captain Morrison. A look of quiet recognition passed between them, though the captain quickly masked it with professional detachment. The veteran colonel at the security checkpoint was now gripping his workstation, his knuckles white. Captain Morrison finally interrupted with visible impatience, leaning forward at his security console. Miss Santos, we don't have all morning. Speak louder or we'll deny access and move on to other contractor requests. The security checkpoint fell silent. For the first time since beginning her verification, Maria looked directly at Captain Morrison. A look of quiet recognition passed between them, though the captain quickly masked it. The graying colonel near the security display leaned forward, his hands gripping his workstation. Suddenly, the main doors to the security checkpoint opened, and an old German shepherd with graying muzzle and military bearing walked slowly into the area. The dog had clearly escaped from the nearby K-9 facilities, moving with the deliberate purpose of an aging veteran. Security personnel began to approach to redirect the animal, but the dog walked directly past all of them, past the guards, past the officers, and sat down calmly at Maria's feet, looking up at her with unmistakable recognition and loyalty. The effect was immediate and electric. Captain Morrison's pen fell from his fingers, clattering loudly on his desk. Several security officers physically straightened at their workstations as if witnessing something impossible. Major Voss's face drained of color. The graying colonel near the security display stood up involuntarily, then slowly sat back down. Complete silence fell over the security checkpoint as recognition dawned across various faces. Some looked confused, others shocked, and a few, those who understood the significance of what they had just witnessed, appeared stricken. Maria continued in her normal soft voice, but now everyone was straining to hear. That's Max, and he knows me because I was his handler with the 75th Military Police Detachment 6 years ago. I was also the K-9 specialist attached to Special Operations Task Force Phoenix, which Captain Morrison personally coordinated 4 years before my records were classified and sealed. She methodically produced a worn, waterproof identification case from her shoulder bag and held it up for the security staff to see. This contains my actual military identification and service records, not the contractor documentation I was forced to use. I'm not Maria Santos, administrative contractor. I'm Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, and I've been dead on paper for 3 years. Captain Morrison attempted to call for order, but found his voice failing him. Ms. Santos, this is highly irregular procedure for security verification. My unit and I were declared Kia in Operation Midnight Shield. Maria continued calmly. I was the only survivor. I've spent 3 years working under assumed identity and waiting for an opportunity to return to active duty, not for personal reasons, but to prevent other soldiers from being betrayed by the same criminal network that destroyed my team. A younger security analyst near the checkpoint desk stood up. This is impossible. Staff Sergeant Vasquez died in Operation Midnight Shield. I processed her casualty notification myself. The graying colonel turned to address him. Sit down, Lieutenant, he said quietly. Look at that dog's response. Military working dogs don't forget their handlers. Maria opened her identification case to reveal service records, deployment patches, and classified documentation. My team was betrayed because we discovered Colonel Rebecca Sterling was facilitating weapons transfers to insurgent groups through a private military contracting network, the same network that provided the false intelligence leading to our ambush. The security checkpoint erupted into controlled chaos. Captain Morrison tapped his pen repeatedly on his desk, finally restoring some semblance of order. His face had lost all color, and his hand trembled visibly. This security checkpoint will pause current operations for 15 minutes, he declared, his voice unsteady. But before anyone could move, Maria spoke again. With respect, Captain, I've waited 3 years to come home. I've lived as a ghost, working civilian jobs, gathering evidence. But I needed to return to active duty to complete what my team started. Captain Morrison slowly leaned back in his chair, his authority visibly shaken. He nodded once, a gesture of reluctant permission. Operation Midnight Shield was classified above top secret. Maria continued. Our mission was to identify the source of American military equipment appearing in insurgent operations across Afghanistan. We traced the equipment to a distribution network operating from a compound near Kandahar. What we found there was a sophisticated trafficking operation with financial records linking directly to Colonel Sterling and her contracting firm. She turned her identification case and removed an encrypted data chip. This contains equipment serial numbers, transaction records, and communication logs. We transmitted this intelligence before we were compromised. That transmission was intercepted and our extraction was canceled. Our team was left to die. Major Voss stood, her voice hollow. I received direct confirmation from Colonel Sterling that Midnight Shield team had been confirmed Kia. The extraction was called off due to impossible tactical conditions. We weren't dead, Maria said simply. We were very much alive and calling for immediate extraction. I heard your voice on the command frequency, Major Voss. You sounded uncertain, but you relayed the abort order. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Maria cautiously. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, if what you're saying is true, how did you survive? And why assume a false identity for 3 years? Maria's composure never wavered, though Max the German Shepherd remained loyally at her side, occasionally nuzzling her hand. I survived because I was separated from my team during the final assault on our position. I was wounded, unconscious, presumed dead along with the others. Afghan civilians found me and kept me hidden while I recovered. By the time I was functional again, the official story was established. My team was dead. The mission had never existed, and Colonel Sterling had been promoted to Pentagon oversight. She looked around the security checkpoint, meeting the eyes of several senior staff members. I needed time to gather evidence that couldn't be easily buried again. I needed to understand who knew about the equipment trafficking and who was simply following compromised orders. Most importantly, I needed to make sure no other soldiers would die because of the same corruption. The graying colonel approached the central verification area. Captain, request permission to address the security staff. I am Colonel James Patterson, retired military police. I was the training officer for the Midnight Shield team. He turned to face Maria. Staff Sergeant Vasquez was one of the finest K-9 specialists I ever worked with. If she says her team was betrayed, I believe her without question. Major Voss interjected. This is all highly dramatic, but it has no direct bearing on current security protocols. Personnel records show clear casualty confirmations, not some conspiracy from years ago. They're connected, Maria replied, Max still sitting calmly beside her. The same criminal network that destroyed my team is still operating, still using legitimate military channels to facilitate equipment trafficking. History repeating itself. Different operations, same betrayal, same source. She pulled another document from her identification case. This is a service record showing that my team reported equipment discrepancies directly to Colonel Sterling 5 times before our final mission. We were told explicitly that pursuing the trafficking investigation would compromise critical operations. We weren't careless. We were set up. Captain Morrison studied the document, his security demeanor cracking further. These intelligence reports weren't included in the operational briefing I received from Midnight Shield. Because they were deliberately removed, Maria said, just like current equipment tracking reports are being modified to hide ongoing trafficking. And just like the evidence was removed from Operation Midnight Shield after my team was eliminated. The security checkpoint had grown absolutely still. Every person present was aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the checkpoint technicians had stopped their routine processing, staring at Maria and Max with undisguised astonishment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached the security console. Captain, in light of this new information, I recommend immediate review of personnel records and potentially reassessing current security protocols. Captain Morrison nodded absently, his attention still fixed on Maria and the loyal dog beside her. Granted, all security procedures will implement enhanced verification protocols immediately. He paused, then added, Staff Sergeant Vasquez will remain under protective custody until these matters are resolved. As staff began coordinating the security changes, Maria spoke again. There's something else you should know, Captain. She removed a final document from her identification case. This is the original deployment order for Operation Midnight Shield with your signature. And this, she produced another paper, is the abort order that condemned my team. The authorizing signatures don't match. Captain Morrison took both documents with trembling hands. Someone forged my signature on the abort order, he whispered, shock evident in his voice. Yes, Maria confirmed. You've been carrying guilt for a decision you never made. The abort order came directly from Colonel Sterling's office. The retired Colonel Patterson moved closer. I always questioned why you would abandon that team, James. It didn't align with anything I knew about your operational philosophy. Captain Morrison looked up, visible emotion crossing his face. I've spent 3 years believing I made a call that got 5 good soldiers killed. I authorized the mission, but I never authorized abandoning them to die. The doors to the security checkpoint opened, and a team of military investigators entered, led by a stern-faced full colonel. What is the meaning of this security alert? The colonel demanded. Captain Morrison, I'm Colonel Patricia Foster from the Criminal Investigation Division. We received an anonymous intelligence package yesterday containing evidence of serious breaches of military law involving Colonel Sterling and equipment trafficking. I understand there may be connected intelligence being reported at this security checkpoint. Maria smiled faintly, gently stroking Max's graying head. Right on schedule, she murmured. Colonel Foster approached her. You would be Staff Sergeant Vasquez, formerly of Midnight Shield. I would be. We have extensive questions for you, Staff Sergeant. Starting with how you survived and why you assumed false identity. And I have answers, Colonel. 3 years' worth. The Colonel turned to address Captain Morrison. With your permission, I'd like to take custody of the intelligence staff Sergeant Vasquez has provided and arrange for her protection pending a full investigation. Captain Morrison nodded. Granted, but I want to be kept fully informed of any intelligence relating to ongoing security threats. Of course, Captain. It appears several current operations have been compromised by the same source. The security checkpoint began to clear of non-essential personnel, but Major Voss remained at her workstation, looking shell-shocked. Maria approached her quietly, Max following faithfully at her side. I don't understand, Voss said, looking up at her. Why would you risk exposure? I'm the one who relayed the abort order that left your team to die. Because you were another victim of the same corruption, Maria replied simply. You followed what you believed were legitimate orders from a trusted superior. The guilt should rest with those who manipulated you, not those who were deceived. How can you be so certain I wasn't involved? Maria allowed herself the smallest of smiles, reaching down to scratch Max behind the ears. Because I've spent 3 years studying every detail of what happened. I know who gave the orders and why. I know who altered service records and who profited from the equipment sales. Most importantly, I know you requested confirmation twice because you suspected something was wrong with the abort order. Major Voss's eyes widened. How could you possibly know that? Those communications were classified. I had help, Maria admitted. Not everyone in the military was compromised. There are still good people within the system who wanted the truth to come out and who wanted to prevent other soldiers from dying because of corruption. As she prepared to leave with Colonel Foster, the retired Colonel Patterson approached. Staff Sergeant, he said formally, then dropped his voice. Maria, we held a memorial service. I spoke about your dedication to your team and to Max. I know, she replied quietly. I read the transcript online. Thank you for honoring our sacrifice. What happens to Colonel Sterling now? Maria looked at the security displays showing current base operations. Now we conduct a real investigation with proper evidence and full transparency. The system can function correctly because someone finally told the truth. The security checkpoint remained suspended in a moment of shocked revelation. Captain Morrison slowly stood from his security console and removed his rank insignia, setting them on his desk before stepping down to stand on the same level as Maria. This command recognizes Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, presumed killed in action, recipient of the Purple Heart and Bronze Star, he announced formally, his voice carrying a weight of regret and respect. The retired Colonel Patterson approached Maria and rendered a perfect salute. Others throughout the security checkpoint followed suit, a ripple of silent acknowledgement spreading through the room. Security personnel who had moments ago regarded her with suspicion now stood at attention, honoring a fallen comrade returned from the dead. Major Voss, visibly shaken, stood to address Maria directly. I never knew who actually gave that abort order. I've been carrying this guilt for 3 years, believing I contributed to your team's death. I know, Maria replied. Your voice on the command frequency that day. I heard your confusion. You questioned the order. Twice, Voss confirmed, her voice breaking slightly. They told me I was risking additional lives by questioning operational decisions, that the intelligence had confirmed the entire team had been eliminated in the initial assault. Captain Morrison's professional demeanor cracked as he turned to face the security staff. I authorized Operation Midnight Shield based on equipment trafficking intelligence that indicated a high-priority target. I did not authorize the abandonment order that came later. The signature was forged. You've been living with guilt that was never yours to bear, Maria confirmed. Colonel Sterling used your command authority to cover her own criminal activities. Colonel Foster stepped forward. Captain Morrison, I'd like to request a formal suspension of current security operations while we secure this evidence and establish proper protocols for what happens next. This has implications for multiple ongoing operations and potentially dozens of personnel. Captain Morrison nodded. Current operations will continue with enhanced security protocols, but all personnel records will be immediately reviewed for potential compromise. He paused. Major Voss, in light of the evidence presented, you are relieved of any responsibility for the Midnight Shield incident pending complete review of the circumstances. As military investigators began securing the security checkpoint and escorting people to debriefing areas, Maria opened her identification case and carefully displayed photographs showing Colonel Sterling meeting with known equipment dealers and insurgent contacts. This was never about revenge, she said softly, addressing the room at large. It was about preventing other soldiers from dying because of corruption and about making sure the military can function with honest leadership rather than criminal interference. As she descended from the verification area, her shadow stretched long behind her across the security checkpoint floor, the shadow of a soldier standing at attention rather than a civilian contractor seeking access. For a moment, she paused to look back at the security displays showing current base operations. The security staff was coordinating with proper information for the first time in years. Captain Morrison was directing operations with restored confidence in his personnel systems. Major Voss was working to identify other potentially compromised records. Colonel Patterson watched her from near the security console, his face reflecting a complex mix of pride and determination. Maria gave him a small nod before continuing toward the exit with Colonel Foster, Max walking faithfully beside her. Her mission wasn't quite complete. There would be extensive debriefings, formal investigations, and probably congressional hearings. The full scope of the corruption would need to be exposed, and those responsible held accountable at every level. But the most important part was accomplished. The truth was out, and soldiers could once again trust that their command structure was working to protect them rather than serve criminal interests. As she reached the security checkpoint exit, a military police officer approached. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Colonel Foster has arranged secure transportation for your continued protection. If you'll come this way. She followed the officer toward the exit, conscious of the eyes following her progress. Security staff, administrative personnel, checkpoint technicians. For 3 years, she had lived invisibly, unremarkable and unnoticed, gathering evidence while pretending to be someone else. Now she walked openly, her identity reclaimed, her purpose fulfilled. The older veteran caught up with her just before she reached the exit corridor. Staff Sergeant, he said quietly. What you did, surviving, maintaining your cover, gathering evidence, coming forward at the right moment, it was extraordinary. I had a duty to my team and to the soldiers who came after us, she replied simply, Max still walking loyally at her side. It was more than duty, he insisted. It was courage of the highest order, and intelligence work of a quality that saved lives. Maria allowed herself a small smile, looking down at Max. You taught us well, Colonel. Both me and Max. I taught you procedures and protocols, he corrected. What you demonstrated today, that came from within. He watched her leave with the investigative team, then turned to Captain Morrison, who had joined them. Some heroes never get the recognition they deserve, he said quietly. They just carry the weight of protecting others. Captain Morrison nodded, watching Maria's figure disappear down the corridor with Max at her side. And some truths are worth waiting years to hear. The morning light continued to strengthen as Maria's escort vehicle pulled away from Joint Base Harmony. Behind her, the security checkpoint buzzed with renewed purpose as base operations moved forward with proper personnel verification and adequate security measures. The security staff worked with restored confidence, knowing their assessments would reach operational commanders without criminal interference. Ahead lay the challenge of ensuring complete justice was served and that the full scope of the equipment trafficking network was exposed and dismantled. But for now, in this moment between what was hidden and what would be revealed, the simple act of speaking truth had transformed a routine security verification into something profound. The power of one soldier's quiet determination to honor fallen comrades and protect those who came after, even when it meant sacrificing years of her own life to gather the evidence necessary to expose a betrayal that powerful forces had tried to bury forever. As her vehicle reached the main gate, Maria's radio crackled with an update from the security checkpoint. All personnel records are being reviewed for authenticity. Investigation proceeding with full transparency. Maria closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in 3 years, gently stroking Max's head as the old dog rested beside her, knowing that this time, the truth would not be buried again.